tonight. We're here to talk about discipline and classroom management and all of those great things in a catechetical setting. I'm a clinical child psychologist by background and also a national catechetical consultant with our Sunday visitors. So I spend a good deal of my time working with our Sunday visitor on our curriculum programs for everybody from preschool all the way through all of those different age groups, and do a lot of thinking about the intersection points between psychology and what we know from the social sciences and catechesis and the ministry to which we're called and the ministry which we love. And I'm interested to know how many of you are working with young children, like preschool, kindergarten, first, second grade. So second grade and below. How many of you are working with that age group? You guys sat over there at the middle table tonight. Okay. And how many of you are working with, say, third through fifth or sixth grade? Okay. Oh, hey, that's that table and the other half of that table. Okay. And anybody working with older middle school students or high school students? All right. Right over there. Sorry you didn't have any fellow high school catechist buddies there. When we do discussion, please join one of the other groups there. So I have for you some questions for reflection for us to open up with tonight. I think this will get us started in just getting into the right mindset to talk about how we want to guide the behavior of our learners in a catechetical session. Number one, when am I most motivated to do my best? When am I most motivated to do my best? What really drives me to do better? Secondly, as a child and teen, what adults in my life did I respect the most and why? And I'm not just talking about who did you show respect to, like who were who scared you enough that you didn't want to cross them. Not that, but deep down inside, who did you respect, right? And why did you respect them? And then third, when and how did I learn to listen to and show respect for God's Word? So let's take just a few minutes to discuss those three questions together, and we'll regroup in a few minutes. So let's talk a little bit about what sacred scripture and what our church documents say to us about discipline and what they can speak to us about management of our catechetical sessions. When we look at sacred scripture, Ephesians 6:4 says, "Do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." There's a contrast in that verse of scripture. What is the contrast between? There's a contrast there between what? Provoking. Say it out loud. I'm going to make you talk. Provoking children to anger, right? And what's on the other side of that? Bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So look at what the scripture is saying. This scripture is saying provoking children to anger is not the same as discipline. It's not the same as teaching them. And instead of provoking them to anger, we should be teaching them something. I work as a child psychologist with a lot of parents who at various times run out of patience, or maybe they don't have skills that were handed on to them. But they will sometimes resort to, you did something I didn't like, so I'm going to do something that you don't like, right? You made me mad, so now I'm going to give this to you and see how mad you get about that. That's not the same as instilling discipline in a child, because discipline ultimately comes from what? It comes from teaching, right? Parents are called what? In when we think about catechesis and teaching children, what are parents called? The first and most important teachers of the faith, right? The primary catechists. And the first and most important teachers of everything that really counts, really. And so if that's the case, and then if by extension other people who are forming children are also teachers, then we should be looking for, when we're talking about discipline, we should be looking for ways to actually teach something, right? So if if a child in a first grade classroom has a pair of scissors and they're running around acting crazy with the scissors and they're not respecting our rules of safety, one of the things that we could do is just sit them in timeout, right? But my question is, what does that teach them, right? On the other hand, we could show them how to walk with the scissors, and we could practice it with them, okay? When you pick the scissors up, you don't run back and swing them around like this. This is how you walk with them. Now do it with me. Let's try it again. Let's try it again, right? And when they learn how to do that, and there's something important about doing it that way, because one of the things we know in neuroscience is that when we practice a new behavior, connections are formed in the brain. We can actually see neural connections coming together. It makes a pathway, and that pathway gets stronger and stronger with more practice. And so we do that so that good behaviors become habits, right? And so when we think of discipline as teaching something, we're going to handle some things a little differently because we're going to practice new behaviors. We're going to say, okay, how do I teach here what needs to be learned in terms of a new behavior? Somebody's talking disrespectfully, gets upset, say in a family, a brother gets mad at a sister and says something really ugly and makes that sister cry. What's a parent's role there as primary educator? I think a good role for that parent is to turn that child to the sister and say, look into her eyes and tell me how she feels right now that you've said that. What do you see? Okay, and so number one, recognizing that feeling, and number two, saying, it's not okay in our family to say hurtful things that make people feel bad. So I understand that you're frustrated because your sister keeps singing that silly song that gets on your nerves. I know that that's really frustrating for you and annoying. Say that in a different way. Try it out. Say it in a respectful way now. And have them practice that again. So discipline and instruction is more about teaching new behaviors than it is about punishing the behaviors that we didn't like. Because that punishment, usually is tied with anger. Number two, there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. This is 1 John 4:18. There's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. There's another contrast in this scripture. What is the contrast between? It's between fear and love, right? Between fear and love. And so again, we talked about fear of the Lord, not being so much being afraid of God, feeling like God might be mean to us, but if we're talking about fear of offending God, it's more about not wanting to disappoint Him because He's so loving and merciful. But also fear of the Lord means something else. So let's get this out of the way before we tackle this verse. When we look at the Catechism and other references in church documents to fear of the Lord, that's often used synonymously with what? Another phrase. Anybody know? Wonder and awe. Right. I saw it over there. Wonder and awe. It's this recognition that God is so big and so powerful and so omnipotent that it's almost overwhelming. That when we reflect on this, all we can do is fall on our knees and say, what an awesome God, right? But even at that same time, that doesn't make us want to run and hide from Him. It makes us drawn to Him. Why? Because Jesus teaches about that God, that He sees us not as little peons that are meaningless because He's so big, but rather as His children, as His own sons and daughters, right? And that He knows how many hairs we have on our heads, right? And so when we realize that this God who is so awesome and so big, this God that we worship also wants to be in relationship with us, we're drawn to Him, right? We love Him, and there's no fear in love. Fear of the Lord means that recognition we need a different word for the fear there, don't we, for that kind of fear. Because that kind of fear is being in awe and wonder at the majesty of God. So let's look at what kind of fear the first letter of John is talking about here in this verse. There's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not perfected in love. Could we all agree in here, as catechists and catechetical leaders, that our job is to help perfect our learners in love? Isn't that our number one job? Would everybody agree on that? Yeah. Because what does Jesus say is the first and greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength. And what's the second that's like it? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? So if the two most important things that we're called to do have to do with love, then I think we could safely say our number one job as people forming others in the faith is to help perfect our learners in love, right? Well, look at this. Fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not perfected in love. So that gives us some insight about how we need to approach discipline with our learners. It's not about fear, and if it's about fear and punishment, then we're never going to get where we need to be with them in terms of perfecting them in love. Let's look at what the General Directory for Catechesis says. This is our guidebook from Rome about how we hand on the faith as catechists. If you're not familiar, catechists, with the General Directory for Catechesis, you can look it up online. It's actually on the Vatican website. Just Google General Directory for Catechesis. It's not as hard to read as you might think. If you don't read any other part of it, at least take a look at what are our 6 tasks of catechesis. What are the 6 essential tasks of catechesis, our 6 jobs as catechists. But here's a quote from the GDC, paragraph 289. May patience and trust abide in the spirituality of the catechist, since it is God himself who sows, gives growth, and brings to fruition the seed of his word, planted in good soil and tended with love. So let's pick that apart a little bit. We're called to be patient and trusting. Why? Because when we look at the rest of this passage, the second 2/3 of it, what is it describing? Is it describing this work as our own work? As whose work? God's work. In the opening prayer tonight, you heard one of my favorite verses from Scripture, and it was a verse that I actually typed up and printed out and put on my computer monitor when I was a DRE, because I needed to remember it every single day. And it was, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but shall do what pleases me, accomplishing the work for which I sent it. Right? And you've heard that verse. You heard it a while ago. Again, what does that tell us? It tells us this is not my work. It's whose work? It's God's work. Right? And when we remember that, and it's critical that we remember that, especially at those times that we're really frustrated with some of our learners, right? Because we can easily fall into a mode where we take this a little too personally, where it becomes like a personal conflict between me and this kid who's acting up all the time, right? And it's not personal. It's not personal at all. This is not even really our work. We're invited to share in that work with God. It's God himself who's gonna grow that seed and help it flourish in the way that God directs. We're just there to help out in the garden, right? And so, when we get that frustrated, instead of taking it personally, we need to go, okay, God, I'm going to need your help with this, right? But we've got to be patient because those things happen in God's own time as well. And the last part of this passage gives us some insight about what we need to do too. Brings to fruition the seed of his word, planted in good soil and tended with love. That we need to tend that with love. So let's look at our framework here for how do we put all this together and come up with a framework for discipline and management in a catechetical setting. I think these are some of the key points here, and we're going to pick these apart a little bit. Number one, it needs to be structured. Look back at that verse from Sacred Scripture from Ephesians 6:4. And let's just notice that. Does that say, do not provoke your children to anger, but just let them do whatever they want? Stay out of their way, let them do what they want to do. Is that what it says? No, it doesn't, right? There's a reason why kids don't live by themselves. It's because they haven't cultivated the discipline yet to guide themselves, right? They need discipline and instruction, right? And they want that. Some kids crave that if they're not getting that, right? And if they're not getting it, what those kids will tend to do, they'll tend to push and push and push at the limits until anybody says, stop it, right? Because they need that structure to feel safe. And so kids need those limits and boundaries. So there needs to be some structure, right? But also, we need to be loving. And clearly, Sacred Scripture, the documents of our church teach us that it needs to be delivered in a loving way. It needs to be positive and not punitive, primarily positive. Now, I want to distinguish here between an arbitrary punishment that's more along the lines of, you did something wrong, so now I'm going to do something to make you feel bad, and a logical consequence. So let's go back to that first grader who's running through the classroom with scissors and swinging them all around. And we've demonstrated and we've tried to teach that new behavior, and lo and behold, that first grader is still doing all the time, just acting crazy with the scissors swinging around. What eventually could happen as a logical consequence? You could say, you know what, we've talked about this and we've worked on being safe with the scissors, and you're still choosing not to be safe with the scissors, and I know that you can do it because we practiced it. And because you're making that choice, I'm sorry, you're going to lose the privilege to use the scissors right now. Right? That's a logical consequence. And I don't find that unkind or unloving at all. In fact, it's loving because you're saying, I want you to be safe. Right? But it's a logical consequence. So let's contrast that with a punishment. But also, our primary way of helping to shape behavior needs to be not punishment or even negative consequences, but positive consequences and a positive environment. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Also, in this beginning framework, again, we need to be patient and we need to be trusting of God as well. So let's start with the structure. That was the first on the list there. And we're going to hit a couple of different important parts of the structure here. We're going to talk about arranging the space, and then we'll talk about the schedule and activities that we use in our catechetical sessions, and then we'll talk about behavioral expectations. So let's begin with what we do to arrange the space. Our spaces for our catechetical sessions, they need to be inviting. There needs to be something that says, this space is for you. Now, I don't know how many of you have been here to this campus before. Some of you might not have known exactly where to go. But when you walked into this room and you passed the table with the books and you saw these round tables and you saw the sacred space there and you saw other catechetical leaders there, and somebody said, hey, how are you doing? It's good that you're here. At that point, you probably were pretty sure that you were in the right place, right? Yeah, because the space was set up for you. If you'd come in here and instead of all of this, there'd been a lot of floor space and a lot of toys around, and little kid activities, and you walked in here, would you have gone, oh, this must be the place where they're having the catechist training? Would you have said that at that point? No, you would have said, this is not the space for me, because it wouldn't be set up for that. And so we've got to arrange the space in a way that says this space is for you. Now, how many of you catechists teach in a setting where you're sharing that space with other groups that use the same room, right? And maybe use it for different functions and things like that. So that becomes a challenge sometimes, doesn't it? To set up that space and make it a space for this particular group. I think it's worth some investment of time on the front end, even if you have to do that every session. And set up the space for your learning. You're going to have to move everything back, so try to do it in an efficient way, put things where you found them, but do what you can to make that space say this is for you. We want it to be inviting. If you are able to decorate, if you're in a room where you can do some of that, make sure that the decorations, for example, are targeted toward that particular age group and also are on their eye level. If you have any doubt, when you walk into the room, get down on your knees at the doorway and look around and say, if I was that tall, would this look like this space was for me? Or is everything hung up here at the adult's eye level where I have to do this to see all the posters and things like that? So we want it to be inviting. Secondly, we want it to be interesting, but not cluttered. There's a fine line there sometimes, isn't there? Interesting, but not cluttered. You know the difference between Target and Walmart? They sell a lot of the same things. But for me, one of them seems a lot busier and more overwhelming. The aisles are taller, there's just more stuff packed together everywhere and stuff. And the other one seems just a little more spacious and organized and feels a little easier to shop in. I won't say which is which, but I think you know. But I do notice that in one of those stores I hear a lot more crying babies than the other. Because the littler you are, the more sensory overload you're likely to get, because those neurosensory systems are not yet mature. And so the smaller the kid, the more they could get overwhelmed by the environment if the environment is too chaotic. But you know what? The environment has an impact on our behavior even through adulthood. And let me give you an example of that. In New York City, they were able to lower the rates of violent crime. You might have heard a couple of decades ago, nobody walked around New York City at night. You wouldn't walk around Manhattan at night like some people do now because you could get mugged or you could get murdered or, you know. And when they decided that they wanted to clean up that city and to reduce the rate of violent crime, here's one of the things they did that might surprise you. They went around and they looked for all the broken windows, and they fixed all the broken windows, and they cleaned off all the graffiti. And did you know that as a result, the rates of robbery and murder fell in the city? Isn't that interesting? And here's the theory about why that was. Because when people walk around and they see broken windows and graffiti everywhere and everything, it sends two messages. Nobody's looking and nobody cares. And the environment sets the tone. The environment of chaos out here causes chaos in behavior, right? So when they cleaned things up, when things looked nicer, the buildings were repaired, the windows were repaired, the graffiti was scrubbed off, the message was, this is an organized place where people are expected to engage in good behavior and be good citizens. People are watching and people care, right? And then all of a sudden, these rates of violent crime fall as well. So even for adults, the environment sets the tone for behavior, but it's especially true for kids. We want it to be interesting, but not cluttered. We also want it to be functional. So you want to set up the room for what you're actually doing that particular day in your session. And one good kind of general room arrangement that I think works for many different lesson plans, or at least the way that we need to kind of plan our lessons to chunk these smaller periods of time, is to have a sacred space, like the sacred space that you see over there, or something like that, where we set up a focal point, an area to pray and gather around. So to have a sacred space that we can gather around and some floor space there, and then also some table space. So when the kids come in, and I've seen how you guys do time in California, right? So I know that 6 o'clock doesn't necessarily mean 6 o'clock. It could mean 5:45, and it could mean 6:20, right? And so it's very much the same where I come from too. You have those kids that come in early, usually the ones that have some of the biggest behavior problems, right? Mom or dad kind of comes in and says, "Is it okay if I leave them now? Okay, see ya." And so we got those kids, and then later on. Other kids come, and maybe a little while into the class session, somebody shows up with their child. They said, "Okay, if he still comes in tonight, okay." And so eventually everybody's there. But as they're trickling in there at the beginning, We could have an activity ready to go at the tables. So as soon as they come in, it's inviting, there's something out, ready for them to do. They sit down, they get started with that. And then once it looks like there's most of the group anyway there, maybe we move over into the sacred space and we have an opening prayer ritual or something like that. And then we move into the story. And then when we're finished with that, we move back to the tables to do something else over at the table. So we're moving back and forth that way. So we want to set up the room for that function. Okay? And the other thing we want to do is we want to be proactive. So in this room, what I would do if I was looking at this arrangement right here, I'd probably move that table where you guys are sitting there out a little bit to that corner for two reasons. One, so that we have some more space in front of the sacred space so that we could gather there when we go back and forth. But also, do you notice this big stretch of empty space that goes down the middle here? What happens, especially in a class of little kids, when you have these big swaths of space? And think of your parish hall, because we're here in a parish hall. So we've got a big old space right there, big old space right there. The adults get to talking. What do the kids do? It's time for the races, right? We run this way, we run that way, we do cartwheels this way, we come back this way until finally the adults say, oh, that doesn't look safe, and they go over there, right? The same thing happens in a classroom sometimes. We have this big stretch of space with nothing to divide it up. That becomes the gymnastic spot. And so we want to make sure we've been proactive in the way that we set up the room. We also want to make sure that anything they're not supposed to touch is already put away. Right? It's much easier than saying 50,000 times throughout the session, okay, don't touch it, you're not supposed to use that, no, take your hands off of that. Let's just put it up before they come in. Even if we have to put it back out, if it belonged to somebody else and they're going to be looking for it, that's fine. But, put it away. That's all the more reason really to put it away, right? As long as you remember where it came from. So make sure any forbidden objects are put away. On the other side of that, make sure your activity supplies are ready. So whether you're working with teenagers or whether you're working with little kids, if you have to kind of go, oh, okay, we're doing this. Hang on, I'll be back in just a few minutes. I'm going to go down the hall and ask the director if they have any of this, and I'm going to get the materials together. It says two things. You weren't important enough for me to be ready for you. And you guys are just going to have to figure something out. You're left to your own devices. Now, the younger the child, although I don't really trust teenagers either, but the younger the child, the more, if we leave them to their own devices, they will tend to do some things that we would rather them not do. So we need to be ready for them, right? We need to have everything ready to go. Also, participant proximity is so important. Proximity to the catechist and others. So be looking around. Sometimes some of those kids that are most likely to really act, if you have kids that do a lot of acting without thinking, they may strategically sit themselves in the back of the room, because they know when I get right here up front, I always get in trouble. And so it might even be an unconscious thing. Or for some of the teenagers, it's a very conscious thing. I want to text tonight. I don't really want to participate in it, so I'm going to sit way back here at the back. Now, that all really changes. If you start walking through the class, talking with them, interacting, with the tables, the people that are back there asking questions, they start looking sharp because they're ready for that conversation. They don't want to be caught off guard, right? And so proximity gets really important. Also, where you see people, for example, if you're gathering around the sacred space in prayer time, you have a kid that tends to get really rambunctious and noisy during the prayer. Seat him right next to you. Right? And especially if it's a little kid, you can accomplish that by saying something like, hey, Peter, come sit right here next to me. I'd like you right here. And say it just that way. You don't have to say, okay, you sit over here because I know how you do during the prayer. Don't do it that way. Say it in a really positive way, that makes them go, oh, yeah, the teacher wants me right next to them, and comes and sits down. They don't need to know why, but you know why. And it gives you an opportunity to just keep an eye out. So proximity can be very important. Let's talk a little bit about schedule and activities. Today's kids are really overscheduled. Has anybody noticed that? They've got a lot going on, and it comes at them really fast and really strong. And they're used to that. And their brains have rewired themselves for that hectic kind of schedule and those little discrete bits of information that come at them all the time. And so attention spans are decreasing. One of the last good stats that we had on attention span was that attention span is about equal to age in minutes up to the early 20s. We know now that it's decreasing even more than that. If you look at the work of Dr. Clifford Nass, that's spelled N-A-S-S at Stanford University, you'll find that some of the modern technology, tablet technology, is actually changing the wiring of the brain, particularly in the attention center of the brain, and making kids' attention spans even shorter. It's kind of scary stuff to look into, but I think we need to look at this as a society. But let's just go with that more generous estimate that attention span is equal to age in minutes up to the early 20s. Even that is kind of a scary idea, isn't it? I mean, how many of you guys at these two tables are working with kids that are like in 5th grade and under, right? So 5th graders are 10 or 11. How many minutes do you have their attention? 10 or 11 minutes. Even scarier for those of you that are working with preschool and little kids, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, right? 2nd graders getting ready to celebrate First Reconciliation, First Communion, really important year, right? How many minutes do we have their attention? 7 or 8, right? Now, I'm going to take a wild guess here, and I'm going to assume that your catechetical sessions are probably longer than 7 or 8 minutes. Is that right? I don't know anybody that has them that short. So we got to do something to reset the attention clock here, don't we? So let me tell you something that tends to reset the attention clock. And you've probably already done it because we've been in here longer than 20-something minutes, which would be the attention span of an adult. So have you ever noticed that when you're sitting and listening to something for a while, this feels good. And then a little while later, you just kind of want to do this, right? And then maybe you'll do this. And then maybe you'll do this a little while later. We don't usually even stop to think about it. But do you know what's going on there? Our brain is saying, okay, I'm going to sleep now. You got to wake me up. And so we move our bodies, and it wakes our brain up and resets our attention clock. So if we know that, what do we need to do with kids? We need to get them moving. We need to get other senses involved, right? If we've been talking for a few minutes, let's show something visual. Let's get them to get up and do something. This is one reason why we move back and forth between our areas of the room that we've set up when we've arranged the room, is to reset that attention clock. Use multiple intelligences, multi-sensory learning techniques. Anybody in here that's using the Alive in Christ program, you can actually get on, make sure that you're aware of everything that's available to you online, because there's an online lesson planner. You just kind of click a couple of things and it prints out your lesson for you and everything. There also are things that you can check and include in that lesson plan that are multi-sensory activities for multiple intelligences. So some of our learners learn best if we do something kinesthetic and there's movement. Other learners learn best if there's something visual. And we can bring all of those senses into the lesson. Let's not send the idea that, in order to learn about the faith, you have to be really interested in just staring at a book and passively absorbing information as people read and writing things in the blanks. Because you know what? That doesn't appeal to many of our learners for very long. We have the books for an important reason. It's important that we all kind of be on the same page, right? That our language is kind of standardized and we know that it's theologically correct. That we are able to present a comprehensive and systematic overview of the teaching of the faith, because if we didn't have those books to anchor us, we would probably get a little off track in our language, and we certainly would get a little off track in presenting the fullness of the faith, because we'd be talking about our favorite stuff, let's face it, right? We'd be talking about our favorite stuff. And so those textbooks help keep us on track. It's important for us to use them, but there are many ways to use them. And we can take those activities and we can make them multisensory. And there are great ways to do that. We offer several ways to do that. If you're using another curriculum, you might find that they offer some ways to do that as well. But we want to make those multisensory. So we're going to talk a little bit about behavioral expectations, about setting the tone for behavior with our expectations. And there are two parts to this. I think number one, we want to set up a positive climate. We talked about how the positive piece of it is so important. And so we're going to begin with that. And then and a little bit later, we're going to talk about rules. What kind of rules do we have? I'm going to give you some rules about rules, okay? And including, do we even call them rules or do we call them something else? So we'll talk about that in just a second. But let's talk about a positive climate. A positive climate is one in which gifts and talents are appreciated, where it's recognized that everybody has something to contribute. Everybody has gifts and everybody has areas of need, right? And so looking for those gifts, especially if you have a kid that is really having a tough time, whether you're working with teens or whether you're working with little kids, you're having a kid that's really having a tough time and really struggling with you, look for what are the gifts, what are the talents here, and how do I encourage that, name that, and begin to draw that out. My wife and I started as catechists working with second graders. And we worked with, by the way, here's how we got started. We were sitting week after week in Mass hearing this announcement that the DRE was making. We still need catechists for second grade, right? Maybe some of you heard that announcement. Thanks for responding to it, yeah? But, I was studying to be a graduate student in child psychology, or I was a graduate student studying to be a child psychologist, and my wife was a teacher. And so both of us worked with kids in our regular day lives, and we were hearing this announcement over and over thinking, we probably could do that, we probably should do that. But then we were saying, well, we'll wait and see if they get anybody first. And maybe some of you said that too. Well, we finally decided that somebody was us, and so we volunteered. But then we found out why they were having trouble getting a teacher for this class. Because this class was notorious. They were infamous. And every year, when they'd been together since pre-K, every year when they moved up, the teacher who was supposed to take that grade decided they needed to take a sabbatical because everybody knew this class, right? And there was a cast of characters in there. And one of those little characters, since I'm on video, I'm going to change his name. One of those little characters was Robert. And Robert, he came in like a little firecracker. He would come in and bounce around like a ping pong ball. He was full of energy. Robert was always, jumping right into whatever it was. If we had materials on the table, he was all about the materials, getting started before we even explained what to do, right? If we were having a class discussion, he was cutting into the discussion. Robert would just talk right over kids. Didn't raise your hand. You never heard of that, right? You just cut right in. If anything was happening with movement in the classroom, he'd be all in other people's space. And kids are going, hey, watch it. If we turned around for very long, we might turn back around and Robert might be right there on top of the table and wondering how he got there. But at the same time, when we would talk to Robert one-on-one, he seemed like he had a good heart deep down inside. He wanted to do a good job. It's just that he never stopped to think before he made a decision, and so it was rough. But he was just one of the kids in the class. We had some other characters in there too. So we decided really quickly that I was going to have to get out all my psychology tricks, and my wife was going to have to use all her teacher tricks. And so one of the things, of course, that we'd heard is that we need to look for the good behavior and encourage that. And in a Catholic setting, one of the things we talk about a lot is gifts and being good stewards of the gifts that we're given, the talents that were given by God. So we started looking for those talents in the kids that we had in our group, and started naming those gifts and calling those out and connecting those with saints that also shared those gifts as well, so they'd have some examples to follow also. And this all culminated at the end of the year in something that we did called the Saint Awards. And we went to the Catholic bookstore and we bought a whole bunch of those little inexpensive medals. They were 50 cents back then. They're probably more like $1 now. But we got those inexpensive little medals, and we got a different saint for every child. and we started matching them with saints that they emulated. And some of them were really easy. Like, we had this one little boy who loved animals, and he always remembered to pray for the poor. So guess which saint he got? Saint Francis, right? And then we had one little girl who loved to sing, and when we had music time, she always sang out. She really was into music, so she got which award? Saint Cecilia, right? And then we had, those kids that you ask a question, and especially the younger they are, the more they're likely to go, oh, right? It's like they almost are going to burst with the answer to this question because they want to answer every question, and we're kind of going, oh, okay, thank you. Let me see, does anybody else have an answer? Do we want to try to get some other kids to talk? So those junior theologians, we had a St. Thomas Aquinas Award, a St. Teresa of Avila Award for our junior theologians. Then we got to Robert. We thought, what award are we going to give to Robert? Because I don't know if he'd ever gotten an award before. I don't know what it would have been for. Maybe perfect attendance at school or something. But we were kind of struggling. But then we thought, well, he does have a lot of energy. We could say that about him. And he's really enthusiastic. He's not afraid to try something new, right? He certainly is impulsive and distractible. Certainly is all of those things. And then we thought, hey, wait a minute. There's a saint who was full of energy and not afraid to try something new, but also struggled with being impulsive, acting without thinking. One time even cut off a centurion's ear, right? And he was always sticking his foot in his mouth, blurting things out, and Jesus even called him Satan one time when he did that, right? He was always the first to want to try whatever was going on. He jumped out of the boat to walk on the water towards Jesus, right? But he also had some attention problems. He took his eyes off Jesus, started getting distracted by the wind and the waves, and started to sink. If there's a patron saint of ADHD, it must be St. Peter, right? So we decided Robert was going to get the St. Peter Award. So we got everything ready. We called all the parents and said, hey, everybody come 20 to 25 minutes early to pick up their kids today because your child is going to get a special award. If you ever want to get every single parent to class, tell them their child is going to get an award because every single parent was there. We had prepared these certificates for each one, the St. Teresa of Avila Award, the St. Francis Award, the St. Peter Award. We printed them out on used Microsoft Word and formatted them, printed them out. We also tied a piece of cord to each one of the medals so that they could put that medal on when they got it. So we had everything ready. And one by one, we would read about the saint. Say, St. Francis was known for his appreciation of all of God's creation. And his love for animals and all created things. And he also had a great devotion to the poor and was known for his service to the poor. And we have a child in our group who loves animals and also always remembers to pray for the poor. And we see the gifts of St. Francis in him. And the St. Francis Award goes to Jason. And Jason would come up and get his certificate and get his medal and everything. So one by one, we were doing that, and we saved the best for last. So, Robert didn't seem to notice that he was the only one that didn't have an award. I'm not sure he was paying attention. But we got to this point where we read about St. Peter. We said, St. Peter was full of energy. He was enthusiastic, and he was always the first to jump into whatever Jesus had planned. And because of his courage, because of his energy, Jesus knew that he would make a good first pope for us when Jesus went back to be with God in heaven and chose him as our first pope. We have a child in our group who's full of energy. He's always ready to jump into whatever we have planned, and we know that God has big plans for him too. And the St. Peter Award goes to Robert. Now, those scenes in movies when something significant happens and this beam of light just shines down on somebody? That's what it was like. Robert just lit up like, what? I got an award? He started floating in the air, just glided 2 feet off the ground all the way up front to get this certificate and to get this medal, just as proud proud as anything, big smile on his face. A couple of years later, we had moved across the country because I had finished graduate school, and we got a Christmas card in the mail from Robert's family, and he was now in fourth grade. And Mom had written in that card, "Robert still thinks of you often, and he wears his St. Peter medal every day." Yeah. And then several years later, Robert was in 8th grade. We got another Christmas card from the family, and it said, "Robert's St. Peter medal oxidized and fell apart a while back." I had to get the cheap kind, I was a graduate student. But it said, "We got him a sterling silver one, and he still wears it every day." That connection with a saint can be so powerful, especially for those kids that struggle. Because what we're doing when we make that connection is we're saying, there's a place for you here. Even though you struggle, even though you have some areas of need, there's a place for you here. And not only that, you could be a saint. You could be a saint because your gifts are so important in our church. Right? So don't underestimate the power of pointing a child to his or her gifts. The positive climate needs to be a place where positive feedback is given, where we share with our learners the things that they're doing well. And it's amazing how that can motivate some behavior change, even in the other kids who hear that. So in that particular group, we would gather around the sacred space, and it was kind of hard to move that group from point A to point B, right? So we would mention several times that we were gathering around the sacred space. People would be over here still talking and playing and doing art projects, and maybe a few people over the sacred space, but wrestling on the floor and stuff like that. But we could always count on Molly to be ready. She'd be sitting there like this, ready for prayer time. And when I would say, "Oh, Molly, you are doing such a great job. You are ready for prayer. I can see that you're ready to worship God right now." Then some other kids nearby would go, "Oh, okay, all right, I guess it's time." And eventually they'd start coming over, and eventually even Robert would look over and say, "Why is everybody over there?" Oh, okay. And he would come over there as well. Right? All because, not because I called anybody down out there, but because I was saying, "Hey, you're doing a great job over here," and called attention to that good behavior. So positive feedback is given in a positive climate. It needs to be a climate where the best is expected and encouraged. If we come in as catechists and we say, "All right, y'all, I don't want any of that cutting up tonight. I know how you are sometimes, and you sit over here because I know what you do during prayer time," If we do that, then we are laying out the expectation for negative behavior. We're saying, what I expect from you tonight is the worst, right? And kids don't rise to expectations we don't set. They rise to so if the expectation is here, guess what? This is the best we can hope for. If the expectation is here, we might get something different. So what we could do instead, even for some of our toughest group members, even for those teenagers that are super defiant and uncooperative and always causing trouble in class and distracting everybody else, how about a little meeting at the beginning before everybody gets in there and say, "Okay, come over here for a second, I want to talk to you." So we're just talking one-to-one, not everybody else can hear. And you say, I want to ask for your help with something. I've noticed that your friends in the class here really tend to kind of look to you and look up to you, and I think you could really be a leader in our class. And there are things that I'm supposed to get accomplished in here, and I want to be able to do them. And I really think you could help me with that. And here's what I need from you. And just give them one thing you'd like them to work on a little bit more. Could we at least try to be respectful during the prayer time? Instead of getting your phone out or doing other things or laughing and talking to your neighbor. Could we at least just try to be respectful and focused during that prayer time? I think you could do it. What do you think? And to get that commitment and for them to hear you say, "I think you could do it," is so important and so powerful. You might be thinking, "Oh, that'll never work." But let me tell you, I have worked with some of the most difficult kids to work with. I've worked with kids that have been hospitalized because their behavior is so difficult and so dangerous that they can't be safe going to school or at home with their families. And I've led groups with those kids. So you want to talk about oppositional and defiant behavior. I have seen it, right? But something can be so powerful even with those kids. And it's saying to them, I know that you can do this. Especially for those kids. There might not be anybody else in their life that looks at them and says, I know that you can do this. I know that you can do a good job. How do we know? Because we trust that God made everybody good. Right? Because we trust that God made everybody to love Him and to love others. That's how we know. Sometimes we don't see any other signs, right? But we know that at least, right? So we can say to them with confidence, I know that you can do this. And we might be the only person that's saying it. But sometimes hearing that from somebody can change a life. So it needs to be a setting where the best is expected and encouraged. We also need to have a positive climate where the catechist facilitates collaboration. Now, sometimes kids are defiant and they say they don't want to do it. They don't want to do what we're doing right now. Not because they just, refuse to do it because they're inflexible and they're contrary and all of that, but because deep down inside they're kind of afraid they can't do it. Sometimes we get that attitude because of that. So if we have a child with dyslexia, for example, and we're doing something where we're reading things out loud, it's a lot easier for that kid to say, oh, this is stupid, I'm not going to do this. And save face instead of saying, oh, I can't really read, right? And so number one, we want to be conscious of doing things in multiple senses and multiple modalities so that everybody can do it together and feel comfortable. And especially when we start getting to the sense that one of our kids really struggles. If you're using the Alive in Christ curriculum, one of the things you have available to you online for free is adaptations for every single activity on every single page. Everything. So you're looking at page 13 and you're thinking, some of my kids might not be able to write all of this out. Look at it online, page 13 in third grade. What do we do here? Oh, here's an activity where we can use the same content, but do it in an active way where we're moving around the room, right? Instead. And we're also going to capture the attention of those kids that have attention problems and impulsive behavior while we're at it. So you have adaptations for every single activity where you can make those activities more inclusive. That's the way to be truly inclusive, I think, in catechesis, is to do some of these. And it benefits every learner in the group when we can do that. The more we can be multisensory in our approach, it's not just for those kids that might struggle otherwise. It benefits everybody. We're resetting everybody's attention clock when we do that, right? So we look for that. But one of the things that we can do when we're doing those kinds of things, especially if there is going to be some writing or some reading or something like that, is to put kids in groups where they're working together. That's one kind of adaptation that we can do with those activities. And say something needs to be read. We look for the ones that we know are our strong and willing readers. And we number the kids, so this is a group of 4. You're partner 1, partner 2, partner 3, partner 4. And then we, go to each group. Now, partners 1 and 2, I want you to be the readers because we know that partner 3 or 4 really struggles with it, but we don't ever say that. You be the readers, and partners 3 and 4, here are your jobs in the group. And so we spell out everybody's job. We give them time limits for each task that they do, and the group process is organized, and nobody's being asked to do something that they might not be able to do. We're all collaborating and using our gifts. So the catechist facilitates collaboration in a positive climate. Finally, it's important that we keep a sense of humor. Sometimes that's all we have left, isn't it? There was a little boy named Buddy who was growing up on the East Coast a couple of generations ago, prior to Vatican II, going to the cathedral school. And at that school, every boy would have a turn. It was just boys doing serving as altar servers at that point. Every boy would have a turn where they were asked to serve in the Mass at the cathedral. And came time for Buddy to serve, and Buddy was a little like that boy Robert that I mentioned earlier. Impulsive, didn't stop to think before he did things, inattentive, disorganized. And so you can imagine his mom was a little worried when it came time for him to serve at Mass. And she was even more worried because the rector of that cathedral, the priest he was going to be working with and serving at Mass, was a very strict, stern old Irish priest. And I mean, he was serious. If he'd ever cracked a smile, nobody remembered it. And so she's thinking, my little boy buddy and this priest could be a bad combination, right? Oil and water, right? Okay? But the priest was in a pretty good mood because he had just done some renovations on the cathedral and done some restoration. And as you might remember, back in those days prior to Vatican II, the altar was way up front here. And in a cathedral, you had lots of space in front of the altar, even more than in other churches. And then you would have, so the sanctuary space there that's not really broken up with anything. And then you would have a big communion rail, and then the people would be back there. So the people are pretty far from the altar, and there's all this space in between. So this rector of the cathedral said, I'd like something there to kind of break up the space. So he orders this very expensive imported Asian rug that he's going to put right there in the sanctuary space. And he's thinking, it'll be a little softer on the feet, and also, it'll be a nice kind of addition to the decor of the cathedral. So he orders this very large, very expensive rug, comes from the other side of the world. He gets that out there and places it really nicely. And shortly thereafter was when Buddy was going to serve at Mass. And so one of Buddy's jobs at Mass was to be in charge of the censer, the incense thing that kind of lifts up like this. Some of you already know where this is going. I can tell from your face. It kind of lifts up on the chain, and you put the incense and the coals in there and fire it up, and you lower it down. The smoke comes out the holes on the sides. You've seen those. You see those in Mass probably recently at the Easter liturgies, right? And so he gets it all ready to go, and the smoke is coming out. He's lowers the lid back down on it. What he didn't realize was when he put the lid back on it was just a little bit crooked, just a little bit off, not really very noticeable. Even the priest didn't notice it. So he hands it to Father. Father does the incense. What Father didn't notice was this one little lit coal that jumped out and landed right on that rug. So then, Father goes and begins to pray the prayers of the Mass, facing the altar away from the people, right? So he can't see the rug anymore, but Buddy sees it. He sees this little wisp of smoke coming from the middle of the rug where this little lit coal has now caught the rug on fire. And he begins to try to get Father's attention. Psst, Father. Well, Father doesn't turn around, and so Buddy gets a little louder. He's thinking maybe the guy's hard of hearing. He's kind of older, and Father. Well, finally the priest decides this kid is not going to be quiet. He turns around, thinking, I can't believe this. Looks at him and says, what is it, son? Buddy points to where there's now a small fire in the middle of the rug. Now, the people, remember, are way back behind the communion rail. They can't see the fire that's here on the ground. The smoke in the air, he had just done the incense, so there was already smoke in the air, so they don't know what's going on. But what they do see is they're usually very stern and reserved parish priests all of a sudden do this. And then proceed to turn around and finish praying the prayers of the Mass. Well, usually, Buddy had kind of a short attention span. And he usually was ready for Mass to be over pretty quickly if it ran long. Today he was thinking, I hope there are a lot of announcements or something, right? Because he was dreading that moment when he was going to walk back into the sacristy with Father and have to face the wrath of this grouchy priest, right? He knew he'd really messed up. But the time came. Mass was over and they were walking back into the sacristy. He had a drop of sweat dripping down the side of his face. He's thinking, I know they'll never let me serve at Mass again. They probably won't even let me be Catholic anymore. He gets back there into the sacristy. Father turns around and looks him right in the eye, and Buddy braces himself a little bit for what's coming. And Father breaks into a smile and says, "Oh, we gave him a good show today, didn't we, Buddy?" And that little boy, Buddy, grew up to be Monsignor Charles Kelly, who was rector of that very same cathedral. And Monsignor Kelly is the one who led me into the Catholic Church 20 years ago at Easter. And I thank God every day that this ordinarily very stern priest found the grace to have a sense of humor. Because what he told Buddy in that moment was, we all make mistakes, we've all messed up, and you are welcome here. And boy, did Monsignor Kelly take that message to heart, because he told so many people, including me, you are welcome here. You have a place here. Thank God for that. Sometimes a sense of humor is all we have left, right? So we got to be able to laugh it off sometimes. So next, let's talk about the other part of behavioral expectations. I'm going to give you some rules about rules. And we don't necessarily have to call them rules if that word doesn't sound good to you, and I don't know if it'll sound good to the kids you work with or not. You could call them expectations. You could call them your community agreement. Whatever you feel like is most appropriate for your group. But there are certain things that we need to do with those expectations. Number one, we need to make them clear. They need to be clear. We've got to make sure that our learners can understand the expectations, and also that they're capable of doing what we're asking them to do. So we've got to know their developmental level and know what to expect. Number two, they need to be concise. If we have rules that are a whole paragraph long and they can't remember the rule, they're certainly not going to be able to do what we're asking of them. They need to be concise. Number three, positively phrased. You know, we want to tell them what we do want them to do. One time when I was at DRE, I walked into a catechist classroom in between sessions, and they had put a poster up on the wall of rules, and it read something like this. It said rules, and it said no yelling, no running, no this, no that. And I thought, well, this doesn't sound like a fun place to be at all, right? But it would have looked a lot different had those things been positively phrased. Remember, kids don't rise to expectations we don't set. So we want to tell them what we do want them to do. Here might be a few examples, and you might change these a little bit depending on the age of the kids you're working with. But a few examples might be: take turns talking, respect other people's space, be respectful and reverent at prayer time, participate in group activities, use inside voices inside. So come up with a few of the most important ones of those, and make sure that you have a list of positively phrased expectations. Now, if you're working with, how many of you are working with, students that are 11, 12, and above? Anybody? Nobody? Oh, a few of you. All right. So for those older kids, and especially those teenagers, a great thing to do is in your first session after, everybody's been introduced and stuff, say, in any group that comes together and wants to get something accomplished, there have to be some expectations. We have to have a little bit of structure and kind of know what to expect. And so I want to talk with you about what the expectations should be in our group. What do you think it's important for us to have as an expectation? What should be our guidelines here? What do we want to make sure that we remember? Some of those teenagers might say, some things like, when people are talking, you shouldn't make fun of them. No judging people for their feelings and saying that's not okay because everybody's feelings are okay. Some teenagers would voice concerns like that. Others might voice other kinds of concerns, right? But turn those into positive rules about respecting one another, about, participating together, working together. Help them phrase those positively and make that list of rules. Sometimes people are afraid to let the kids participate in the process because they're afraid that the kids will come up with some really wacky stuff. But that's not usually what happens. Usually, when we let them help us with the rules, they're even a little harder on themselves than we would be on them. And that puts us in a position where we can lighten it up a little bit, where we can say, hey, wait a minute, do you think we really need to be that strict, or could we ease up on this one a little bit? That puts you in a great spot, because now you're not bad cop anymore, right? You're kind of helping them make their rules reasonable. And then there's community buy-in. They start holding each other accountable because everybody agreed on what the rules should be. And the other thing that they do is they have their own personal investment in it. And so they're more likely to do what they agree that they'll do. We also want those rules, in addition to being positively phrased, we need them to be posted. There should be some visual representation of the rules. And here's why. People are a lot more likely to pay attention to something that they get in more than one sensory way. So they hear it and they see it. And this is especially true and especially necessary for learners with ADHD. The research says that learners with ADHD are less likely to pay attention to auditory stimuli, auditory things, verbal information, more likely to pay attention to visual stimuli, to visual information. That's not true of every single kid with ADHD, but it is true of those kids as a group. And so we want to make sure for those kids that especially have trouble remembering to do the right thing and stopping to think, that they have a signal right in front of them that reminds them to do that. So we have those expectations in visual form. If you're working with little kids, have some pictures on there as well that show what you expect them to do. We can talk about what the people are doing in the pictures, because they need that kind of signal as well if they're not strong readers yet. Next, the rules need to be assertively stated. Assertively stated. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's easiest to talk about what I mean by that if I talk about the two things, the extremes that assertiveness is not. So here's one extreme. When I was a DRE, there were two particular catechists that I remember. One who was really loud. We could hear her all the way down the hall. And if she wanted to tell the kids to do something, she says, okay, everybody, get over from here, get over there to the prayer space now. It's time, let's go, come on. You know, and it sounded kind of aggressive, right? I can only imagine that there were probably some more anxious kids like Molly in there that were kind of going, what did I do, you know, right? And on the other hand, down the hall, there was a teacher that taught the same age level, different class of the same age, who talked more like this. Okay, everybody, could I please get you to finish up your project here? And could I please get you to move over to the sacred space now? Right? Now, the kids didn't respond very well to either one of them, as you probably could guess, right? I mean, if you talk like that second example, especially to young kids, you know, say you have a group of kindergartners or first graders, and they've been working on this art project, or finishing up the art project, and you say, could I please get you guys to come over here to the sacred space now? Then, you know, those kids will hear that as a choice. You asked, you said, please, it sounds like a choice. And some of them may be like, well, no, thanks, I'm going to sit here and keep working on this, right? And so we have to say it like we mean it. The other thing that we do to make sure that we're assertive with that is proximity. Remember proximity? Proximity is your friend if you want to communicate things assertively. You don't just from the prayer space call across the room, hey, can you guys come over here now, right? Because it's not very assertive when you're all the way across the room. If you walk right up to the learner who is still sitting there, not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and you say, it's time for us to come to the prayer space now. I need you to come with me. You know, and you said it in a quiet voice. It didn't sound mean, but it also didn't sound like a choice, right? It sounded like you meant business. And so that's how you assertively state that. And then finally, we want to make sure that those guidelines are backed up by action. If we're in a situation where the kids who are having the most fun in the room are the ones that are misbehaving, then we are in trouble with a capital T, because that's contagious. We'll have kids that don't even usually act up that'll start acting up, because they're like, hey, good things are happening when we act up. Let's do it, you know? So what we need to make sure is that the good stuff is happening to the kids that are meeting the expectations. They're the ones that are getting the praise, they're the ones that are getting the privileges, and others will take notice, right? And sometimes, yes, we have to implement a logical consequence. We're not primarily about punishment, but a logical consequence is something that's negative, but it's connected with what just happened, right? So one example of a logical consequence might be if the class has been really cutting up and not listening and not on track, and you have to say, you know, that game we were going to play that was going to be so much fun, we're not going to be able to get to that tonight because you guys wasted a lot of time and now we can't get to the fun stuff. We need to do better next time, right? That's a logical consequence. You can act like you're just as sorry about it as they are, because you probably are, right? I mean, it's not like you're trying to make them mad. You're just saying, hey, this was a choice that you made. I'm sorry. You know, if we have a little kid who, you know, is running with the scissors and acting all crazy with that, and we've demonstrated how to do this, and we practiced being safe with the scissors, and they still can't seem to manage to be safe, what do we have to do? Logical consequence. They're going to lose the privilege to use the scissors for a while, right? It's a safety thing, right? We're not trying to make them mad. We're trying to keep them safe. And it's a logical consequence. So we want to make sure that our rules are backed up by action. So let's talk about, before we close tonight, two particularly challenging kinds of kids that we might have that we're working with. One is the child with ADHD. So I want to talk a little bit about myths and facts about kids with ADHD. We've talked about some of those kids already, but I do want to get this out of the way, because there's some people that are not sure they believe that there's really such a thing as ADHD. They're like, well, you know, back in my day, we didn't hear so much about that, and I think this is just bad parenting or poor discipline or kids that don't really want to do the right thing. I want to tell you, as a clinical child psychologist, neuroscience has now given us conclusive evidence. We have proof that ADHD really exists, and it's a brain disorder. When we see those kids under brain scans, their brains look different from other kids. You know, and the difference is right here in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right behind your forehead. We see fewer connections in the neurons in that part of the brain in kids with ADHD. It's a less developed area of the brain in those kids. The prefrontal cortex is growing all the way through the childhood years and the teen years, and only finishes growing in the early 20s. That's why attention span is equal to age in minutes up to the early 20s, right? And the prefrontal cortex is not just responsible for attention, it's responsible for anticipated consequences, for good decision making, for self-monitoring, watching ourselves and watching what we're doing, those kinds of things. And kids with ADHD tend to be bad at those things because this part of the brain is less developed in them. There's hope for them because the part of the brain is still growing. You know, we can keep working on it. But it's important to know that, because when you see kids that are always, you know, doing things without thinking, or are a lot more active than the other kids and can't seem to get settled down, it may not be, and it probably usually isn't, that this kid doesn't want to behave. It might be that this kid's brain is functioning differently from the brain of the kid sitting next to them. And I say that because we can never really know, can we? I mean, we're not diagnosing ADHD in our religious education sessions, and sometimes we don't hear if they have a diagnosis or not, and sometimes they don't have a diagnosis, but they sure do have it, right? And anyway, we can never really know. And so it's important that we give them the benefit of the doubt. It's important that we assume that, you know, there's a reason for that behavior. And that can help us be patient with it. Everything that we talked about tonight applies to those kids, only double. You know, multisensory methods, movement, all of those things are so important. We also might want to work out some personal cues with some of those kids. So we might want to have a side conversation outside of the earshot of the other kids and say, I've noticed that sometimes you have trouble stopping to think before you do something, and you know that sometimes you're not following the rules. And I know. They may say, I'm sorry. And, I know that you're sorry about that, and I want to help you do better. Would it help you if I gave you a reminder when I notice that you're starting to do some things you're not supposed to do? And usually kids with ADHD will say, yeah, that would help. They want help. They'll say, yeah, that would help. So work out a signal with them, a code word, something you could do. Like you could say, when I kind of look at you and make eye contact and you see me do this with my ear, something that you wouldn't ordinarily do. When you see me do this, that's a signal to you, watch yourself right now. Okay? So remember that. When you see that, what am I going to do? Make sure they heard you, have them say it back to you. And when you see that, that's a signal that you need to watch yourself. Right? So now you can give them a signal without calling them out in front of the other kids, without any embarrassment or any singling out, but you've told them when they need that reminding. The other thing you can do is have an individual conversation that will help with self-monitoring. So think of that kid that's having this kind of struggle that we've been talking about, and think of all of the things that you'd like them to do differently. And it might be a list of like 10 things that they really need to work on. But prioritize that list. Figure out which one is the most important right now. And then take that one and make that your goal for the class session. And before the session starts, pull them aside, again in a private conversation where everybody else doesn't hear. Say to them, okay, I really need your help. I really want you to work on this. I've noticed that you're having a hard time being respectful during prayer time, and God is listening to us, and He's watching us when we're praying, and we want to show Him how much we love Him because He loves us so much. And I want you to work on being a little more respectful and remembering what we're doing. And so what does it mean to be respectful? You're talking about, okay, we're going to try to sit more still, we're not going to giggle and do other things, And so I want you to work on being respectful during prayer time. And you watch how you do, and I'm going to watch how you do. And then after class, I'm going to ask you, how do you think you did? And see if you can tell me, okay? So get ready and watch yourself. Okay, so you make that agreement because you're encouraging self-monitoring. When kids learn to watch themselves better, they start getting better at impulse control. Self-monitoring is the major thing that the kids with ADHD are really needing to develop. So that's one way we can help them practice that self-monitoring. Now let's talk about this kind of kid. The oppositional defiant kid. These are the kids that instead of appearing very sorry that they've done something wrong, instead of looking like they did it without thinking, sometimes it looks like they spent a long time planning it, right? And maybe they did what we told them not to do simply because we said not to do it. Or they didn't do what we wanted them to do because they guessed that we wanted them to do that, so they didn't want to do it for us. Sometimes with these kids, it can be hard for us to remember that our church teaches that people are made good, that everyone is naturally good. Everyone is created in the image and likeness of God. Is God good? Yes, all the time, right? God is good all the time. Everybody is created in the image and likeness of God. That means there's goodness in all of us. It's corrupted certainly by original sin, but the goodness is there. The divine spark is there. So with confidence, we can look at these kids and say, I know you can do it, because they can do it. They can learn how to do it. But we need to show that confidence. We need to show that expectation. And when we're looking at these kids, one of the things that we really need to remember is that kids act this way for lots of different reasons. Some of our kids might be showing us this kind of behavior, this inflexible, defiant, grouchy behavior, because maybe they have an imbalance of certain neurotransmitters in their brain, a mood disorder that makes them sometimes just feel sad or angry for no apparent reason. And they don't know why they feel that way, but they take it out on everybody else, right? And yeah, they need to learn how to get better at that, but there's something also going on at the same time that's not under their control, and it's important that we be patient because of that. Other kids that might be behaving this way because something is happening in their lives that's unimaginable to us. Something traumatic has happened to them, or somebody is hurting them, and they're taking that out on everybody else. Maybe you remind them of the adult in their life who's been so hurtful, and so they're not going to do anything for you, right? And so it's important that we remember that there could be lots of things going on that we're just not aware of, because we will never know some of that stuff, right? And we've got to give them the benefit of the doubt. If you have some of these kids in your group, I'm going to give you a resource that you can go and look up. It's going to take more time than I actually have tonight to describe in good detail how to use this technique. But it's not hard. It's not hard. There's a technique called collaborative problem solving that helps kids who are oppositional and defiant learn how to work with adults instead of against them. Collaborative problem solving. And it's developed by a psychologist named Ross Greene, Greene. I can tell you as a child psychologist, in my almost 20 years of working with kids, I've never seen anything that works better for these kids than collaborative problem solving. So look up Dr. Ross Greene's book. It's called The Explosive Child. He also has some other books out there now, I think, on the explosive child in a classroom and things like that. Not all the kids he's talking about are explosive, though. Some of them are more implosive, It's like they kind of go within instead of exploding out, but they shut down. They shut down whenever you're trying to ask them to do something. And so those are the kids he's talking about, the ones that are inflexible, the ones that are defiant, okay? And finally, I want to talk just a few minutes on how to talk with parents about kids' behavior. Because this is an important conversation sometimes to have. And number one, I want to say, catechists, make sure that if you're going to have a conversation with parents about kids' behavior, that you've touched base already with the catechetical leader at your parish, with the DRE, whatever they might be called in your particular parish, because they're the ones that really represent the parish and can speak on behalf of the parish in the area of religious education. And so we want to make sure we're on the same page with them so that we're sending a consistent message. So talk with your parish catechetical leader first. And then they may want to be the one to talk to the parent. They may have you talk to the parent, but they want to sit in. Or they may say, let's talk about what you're going to say. Okay, you have my blessing. Different folks would do different things in that situation. But here's a good way to approach this. Number one, we got to intervene early. Catechists, don't wait until you have to go to the office and say it's either me or him. Don't let it get to that point. The first time you begin to see a pattern of misbehavior, and by pattern I mean not the first time they misbehave. I mean, if somebody was giggling during the prayer time, that's probably not the time to go to the parent and report all the things that they're doing, because they giggled during the prayer time one time, right? But if we see a pattern of behavior over a couple of weeks that is just not going to work, and this child's really not going to learn or be a part of the community with that pattern of behavior, that's the time to go and talk with the parent about this. We want to start with something positive. That's one reason why it's important to look for kids' strengths. And why do we want to do that? Because the moment that we begin talking with parents about something their child is doing wrong, for many parents, the defenses start to come up. Is this really a good representation, or is this person just seeing my child as a problem? Maybe they're the problem. Parents start to feel defensive, right? And so it's important that we begin with something positive that says, I see your child as a whole person. I don't just see your child as a problem. I value certain things about having your child in my class. And so for that little boy, Nick, that I talked about earlier, I might have said something like, we really like having Nick in our class. And we really appreciate him because he's full of energy. He's so enthusiastic about everything. He's always ready to jump right into whatever we have planned. And so we'll start with that. And then say, but I've noticed that sometimes he can sort of jump into the materials before we've really explained what to do. And then he gets frustrated because he's trying to do the project and he's done it the wrong way. And I want him to feel capable in our class. I want him to have a good time and feel like he's done things the right way. And also, I've noticed that sometimes, especially at group times when we're gathered around the sacred space and stuff, he's not very conscious of where his body is, and he just gets in other people's space, and it causes some problems for him with the other kids sometimes. They don't want to sit next to him, and I want him to have friends here. I want him to have a good time and feel like he's part of the community. So did you hear what I did in those two examples? I started with the example that I'm concerned about, and I went right into my concern for the child, not for all the other kids, or not for, here's how it's causing me problems. Because ultimately, a parent is not going to care quite as much about the problems it's causing me or how it affects the other kids as they're going to care about who? Their own child, right? And so we want to show, again, that we have concern for their child when it comes to this stuff. And so we do the concern for and by the way, when you're talking about these situations, it's important to give 2 or 3 specific situations. Don't just give one, because it'll always be a good excuse for why that happened. So don't just give the one. But also, on the other hand, don't give more than 2 or 3, because it'll look like you followed them around with a clipboard, just kind of documenting everything they did. You're picking on their kid now, right? So just give 2 or 3. And after you've given those situations or shown concern for the child, take a collaborative stance. Say, how can we work together on this? What can we do? Is there something that you can recommend that might help him do better with this? Or, does he ever have this issue at school? What do they do there that helps with this? I'm willing to try something new. Let him know you're open to that. You're not saying to this parent, okay, you fix this, or I don't want him back in here. We're not sending that message. We're saying we're working on this together. Let's see if we can get on track here. So take that collaborative stance. Finally, don't forget to pray. Pray for each one of your learners by name. It doesn't take very long, just a couple of minutes to name all of them. Pray especially for those kids that are having problems, that are having difficulties, that God will lead them and that God will also lead you. Being open to the movement of the Holy Spirit is essential for the ministry of catechesis. Because whose work is this? Is it our work? It's God's work, right? Whose word is it that we want to communicate? Our word? God's word, right? So we've got to be open to the Holy Spirit. And we've got to pray and ask God to lead us. It's perfectly fine and good to say, God, I don't know what to tell this kid anymore. Will you help give me the words that are going to guide him and get him on the path? Or kids that are struggling to understand, I don't know how to explain it, God. Can you help me? Give me those words and help me. So the Holy Spirit works that way, right? And God profoundly respects our free will. He's never going to force something on us, make us do something, make us say something. But when we say, God, please lead me. Please help me say what you want me to say. God says, I thought you'd never ask. I'd love to help you with that, right? And we could be amazed at what God can do. Thank you so much for your attention tonight. May God bless you in your work. And thank you for responding to the call to catechesis.